A significant number of circumstances contributed to this mass movement. One major factor was economic. There were natural disasters such as flooding and a boll weevil, it's kind of an insect, right? Epidemic that destroyed crops and had a devastating impact on the Southern economy. So people left. Also, as a result of World War I, immigration from Europe had ceased. This created new opportunities for immigrants in the North. The war created jobs and therefore economic opportunities for Blacks. But it also contributed to an expansion of self-perception for many Black Americans. For soldiers who were exposed to other parts of the world for the first time, they began to see themselves as part of a larger Black community. This diasporic thinking was not limited to soldiers. In the United States, several movements at this time energized this idea of being a part of the diaspora. Disenfranchisement and racial injustice, particularly racial violence, also contributed significantly to this migration. Black men and Black women's inability to participate in the political system became codified, in many ways nullifying Southern Blacks' citizenship. Polling sites were spaces of exclusion. They were places where Black bodies did not belong. Poll taxes and other restrictive practices presented a major defeat to the perceived notions that freedom from slavery would equate to full citizenship. The reality for Black Americans was that in addition to a loss of opportunity, that is land ownership, better jobs, and education, there was also a loss of their voice, their inability to participate in their own government. As a result, Black Americans perceived themselves as a nation within a nation. The desire to embrace full citizenship and to express their complete humanity was inextricably linked to their ability to vote. As a result, the inability to participate in elected officials further exacerbated racial tensions, and at times, these tensions turned into violence. Racial violence was also a significant factor for the Great Migration. Lynching, occurring mostly, but not solely in the South, was an act of gruesome violence and included beatings and hangings, tortures and mutilations. The resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan also occurred during this time period. The summer of 1919, often referred to as the Red Summer, marked a period of time when race riots occurred throughout the country, attesting to the ways in which the North and the West was both the land of opportunity, but it was also a place of violent erasure. These atrocities projected the past cruelty of slavery into the present moment. Riots which often resulted in Black bodies hanging from trees served as a constant reminder of the expendability of Black bodies and the pervasiveness of the danger of living in America posed to Black Americans. It is in this context of violence, unfulfilled promises, unrealized hope, and economic deprivation that people moved. These factors precipitated the Great Migration. In this 1917 article in the African Methodist American Church Review, a writer summed up the exodus this way: neither character, the accumulation of property, the fostering of the church, the schools, and a better and higher standard of home had made a difference in the status of Black Southerners. Confidence in the sense of justice, humanity, and fair play of the white South is gone. One migrant articulated the mood with this verse: and let one race have all the South, here color lines are drawn. For Hagar's child done stem the tide, farewell, we're good and gone. And yet, not all of Hagar's children fled the South. Many Black Americans chose to stay in the South. In his book, American Civilizations and the Negro, he wrote that in 1916, Dr. Charles Victor Roman argues that there are two reasons for Blacks to not leave the South. He says, in the first place, this is his home. And in the second place, there is nowhere to go. He is not going back to Africa any more than the white man is going back to Europe, or the Jew is going back to Palestine. The slave trade was the diaspora of the African. The children of this alienation have become a permanent part of the citizenship of the American Republic, end quote. Booker T. Washington held a similar position, at least publicly, disapproving of the migration to the North. The Negro, he suggested, was at his best in the South. Washington's language demonstrates that place and movement were important aspects of creating a discourse that defined the new Negro. The South was both a home and a place from which to flee. The options to stay in the South or leave it are both necessary considerations for a fuller understanding of this great migration. Both options participate equally in the construction of a new Negro identity, and they influence the ways in which Americans, and Black Americans in particular, changed. The Great Migration was a leader or movement without a leader. It transformed not only Black Americans, but also America itself. Joe William Trotter Jr. surmises the migration as such. Quote, not only reflected the African Americans' quest for freedom and jobs and social justice, but also the emergence of new patterns of race, class, ethnicity, gender, and their relationship to place all contribute to the making of the new Negro. The Great Migration demonstrates that migration itself is full of transformative potential. It transformed a people and a nation. Here is an image from the 1920s. It is a rally in Harlem led by Marcus Garvey, the leader of the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And if you can see on the poster there, it says, the new Negro has no fear. It became sort of a motto of this time period. The new Negro has no fear. So now we'll turn to the making of the new Negro. The new Negro was a literary trope. It reached its height of popularity during the Great Migration. The main purpose of this idea was for Black people to represent the Negro. Black Americans have been characterized as uneducated, as docile, as slavish people with no culture, and the new Negro gave them an opportunity to be seen as educated, as proud advocates, as fighters for equality and justice. The new Negro was portrayed as something or someone different than the old Negro. This identity was formed over and against the images in popular American imagination of Blacks as devoid of all the characteristics that supposedly separated the lower forms of human life from the higher forms. That is, the new Negro was fully human and fully present and demanded to be recognized on his own terms. The new Negro identity, a popular trope of its time, represents an attempt to reconstruct Black American identity. What was old becomes new. Paradoxically, the construction of the new was still very dependent upon the old. As Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Jean Jarrett observed, quote, a paradox of this sort of self-willed beginning was that its success depended fundamentally upon self-negation, a turning away from the old Negro. In other words, the new Negro was everything that the old Negro was not. Yet the continued use of the term new itself is an indication that there is something of the old in the new. The new Negro was a counter to the negative images of Negroes that white Americans sought to perpetuate after slavery. Gates writes, quote, accordingly, to manipulate the image of the Black was, in a sense, to manipulate reality. The public Negro self, therefore, was an entity to be crafted. Yet, this constructed, idealized image was as much an illusion as the old one. A new name signified a new life for many, and more moving to a new place underscored the possibility of envisioning a life that was different than the life they had experienced before. If Negro was the name given to Black Americans, then New Negro was a self-designation and a redefinition. Thus, the significance of naming, and particularly its ability to destroy and create, becomes evident. It destroys diversity and individuality, while at the same time creating the appearance, in fact, an illusion of unity and coherence. Creating itself is an act imbued with both power and danger. Any attempts to recreate a people, and most especially an oppressed people, was met with resistance. Despite the fact that the new Negro is a rhetorical device, he was given physical features. I suggest that giving physical features to this trope is an attempt to make it tangible, to make it real. John Henry Adams' essay, The New Negro Man, appeared in the October 1904 edition of The Voice of the Negro. And Adams describes the new Negro in this way. Here is the real new Negro man, tall, erect, commanding. Such is the new Negro man. And he who finds the real man in the hope of deriving all the benefits to be got by acquaintance and contact does not run upon him by mere chance, but must go over the paths of some kind of biography until he gets a reasonable understanding of what it actually costs of human effort to be both a man and at the same time a Negro. The image of the new Negro was vividly painted on the body of a Black man. It was the precise structure and resonance of the Black voice by which the very face of the race would be known and fundamentally reconstructed. In fact, the search for an identity in a home is closely related to masculinity. Nell Painter affirms that, quote, the quest for manhood was older than the Great Migration and would continue long after it. For new Negro men, getting out of the South and casting a vote represented two giant steps into manhood. For a people whose bodies were abused, such a physical reconstruction takes on new significance. The resurrection of the Black body was not slavish or weak. In other words, it was no longer emasculated. The new Negro was self-confident, urban, and lived in the North. He was still envisioned as one man, proud to be a Negro. He fought back when attacked, and he proclaimed pride in his race. This seemingly unified, this oneness of the image of the new Negro, however, falters when challenged by its own diversity. The new Negro did not consist solely of descendants of slaves. Free people of different economic statuses and various ethnicities were also part of this new people. As Painter observed, quote, considered as a whole, the new Negroes were not only a national people, they were also international, multilingual, and ethnically heterogeneous. This cosmopolitan description of the new Negro reveals important distinctions that were occluded by the presentation of a unified identity. Moreover, some scholars suggest that it was, in fact, the elite Blacks who constructed the new Negro identity in the first place. They described them as opportunistic and those who denied their heritage. One description read, disdainful of rural Southern culture, by 1925, Harlem's new Negroes understood their fate was intertwined with poor Southern migrants. The Great Migration had redefined their status from a small, isolated group of Northern Negroes who provided menial services to the wealthy whites into leaders of a large and increasingly powerful racial class. answerable only to its own people. In the 1930s Harlem, old settlers formed migrant assistance organizations, recruited migrants to their churches, provided newcomers legal and medical advice, beauty and financial services. They advised migrants on the appropriate dress and hygiene, and served as both the formal and informal teachers for many migrants. So the old settlers, now the new Negroes, had become leaders in Harlem. The recasting of the new Negro elucidates the internal struggles for Black self-declination. Did the new Negro then represent an assimilation or an accommodation to the United States oppressive practices? To the extent that the elite of any race, of any subordinated people, create, control, and manage discourses, power dynamics must be interrogated. Among the Black elite, W.B. Du Bois, for example, was a socialist and a Pan-Africanist who challenged the political system and fought for equal education and enfranchisement, which he considered to be the fundamental components of citizenship in America. Booker T. Washington, on the other hand, did not seek to challenge the political system, at least not directly. Instead, he advocated for technical education and encouraged participation in free enterprise, that is, Black businesses for Black people. These different approaches to obtaining racial equality both participate in the making of the new Negro. It is my contention that while the new Negro was at times accommodating to the dominant culture, it was at the same time resistant to it. The new Negro was an attempt to hold these and other dichotomies in tension. As a diasporic identity, such tensions will exist, and these conflicts often expose the very fragility of identity itself. The Great Migration generated a new identity discourse for Blacks in America and sparked the imagination of people who produced a plethora of art, literature, and music that changed American culture and identity. The Harlem Renaissance exemplifies this proliferation of creative expression that occurred during this time period. In fact, the Harlem Renaissance is so closely associated with the new Negro identity, it is often referred to as the new Negro movement. From poetry to sculpture, the new Negro is being made over and over again in literature and in art. Moreover, the Bible of the Harlem Renaissance, if you will, pictured here in this slide, this 1925 anthology edited by Elaine Locke, entitled The New Negro, sought to demonstrate the distinguishing characters of the new Negro by displaying its art and literature, fiction and poetry, essays and plays are all found in this anthology. In the foreword of this book, Locke writes, quote, Negro life is not only establishing new contacts and finding new senders, it is finding a new soul. There is a fresh spiritual and cultural focusing. We have, as a herald and sign, an unusual outburst of creative expression. There is renewed race spirit that consciously and proudly set itself apart. Justifiably, then, we speak of the offerings of this book as embodying these ripening forces culled from the first fruits of the Negro Renaissance. I suggest that these artistic expressions is yet another important way of meaning-making for Black Americans during the Great Migration. The new Negro is a constructed and contested diasporic identity, illustrative of the imaginative attempt to create a sense of stability in a hostile and often violent political environment. The Great Migration transformed the context in which Black Americans had previously been developed. This movement created a space for identity to be renegotiated. Upon close examination, the presentation of a necessarily unified identity nevertheless includes diverse expressions of what it really meant to be a Black American in the early 20th century. Changing their orientation in space enabled Black Americans to challenge and transform the ways they have been presented. A new Negro hermeneutic then employs 3 strategies. 1, it remembers or creates a past. 2, it offers instruction for maintaining their identity in a hostile environment. And 3, it provides a utopic and therefore spatial vision of the future. These strategies result in a flexible but always bounded identity that can be responsive to its political and social and ethical context, while at the same time making space to resist it. It is through this lens that I will read the book of Hebrews. Okay, so for Hebrews, this is the only image I have, right? That picture text. So, the author of Hebrews writes, "But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, God has prepared a city for them." Hebrews 11:16. This is the text that inspired the title for this lecture. Because like the new Negro, the audience of Hebrews desires a better country. Just as the social context of the Great Migration is important to understanding the development of the new Negro motif, the social context of Hebrews is likewise necessary for a deeper appreciation for the ways that the text attempts to make meaning. The text represents the social situation of the audience as having experienced suffering, shame, and affliction. These difficulties underscore the potential hardship for a minority community in an imperial context, particularly one that was living on the edges of Romanness and Judaism. It is hard to determine the extent and the severity of these said persecutions. It could have ranged from shaming to exile. But what seems clear from Hebrews is that some of these Christ believers understood themselves to be living in a hostile environment and therefore created this discourse that responded to this. It is imperative to highlight the Roman imperial context, the oppressive rule of Rome, as well as the conquered, subjugated status of the audience, indicating that they were living in a very precarious state. For me, there are 4 motifs that the new Negro analytical lens brings to the fore in the text of Hebrews. 1, the role of the ancestral plane in kinship that play in the formation of a people, particularly an ethnic people. 2, the relationship between migration and autonomy. 3, the material implications of marginality. And finally, the significance of hope for people who are experiencing suffering. A common past is a defining feature of peoplehood and an important feature for constructing collective identities. The text of Hebrews depends on the ancestors to understand their current situation. Hebrews begins its discourse by underscoring the importance of these ancestors, of lineage and also inheritance. The author writes, "Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors, and also to a son who he appointed heir of all things." This son is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, a representation of the essence of God. Hebrews 1:1 and 3. The audience is immediately made aware of a connection to the past, specifically their ancestors and their special relationship to God. The author then reaffirms Jesus' relationship to God. Jesus' status is directly connected to the audience as they are portrayed in this text as his brothers and sisters. And also they are called the children of God. Jesus is not only a reflection of God's glory, he is also the pioneer of this community. The author writes, "Christ, however, was faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house if we hold firm the confidence and the pride that brings hope." In Hebrews, participating in the household of God requires faithfulness and hope. In addition to their divine heritage, they are part of the household of God. The author also describes the audience as descendants of Abraham in Hebrews 2:16. The audience is grafted into the lineage of Abraham, who set out for a place where he was to receive an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going. He migrated to the land of promise as in a strange land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the fellow heirs of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that had a foundation, whose architect and builder is God. Hebrews 11:8-10. The audience, heirs of this same promise, are similarly on a journey towards a heavenly city. As with Abraham, the covenant that God makes with the house of Israel is reaffirmed. That is, God puts his laws in the minds and writes them on the heart of these people. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. The ancestral claims in Hebrews describe the audience as members of God's household. They belong to God. They are God's people. Kinship is always social, and it establishes relationship. But more specifically, it establishes relationships of power. The language of enthronement in Jesus' sonship exhibits his authority. Jesus, the prototype of the faith for the audience, is declared the appointed heir of all things in Hebrews 1. The conferring of this new title to Jesus, and by extension, the status of his related audience, makes clear their potential for an elevated status in the future. They too can be heirs of all things. Jesus is no longer a convicted criminal. He is now an exalted son, sitting at the right hand of God. As the author explicitly states, a change in the priesthood necessitated a change in the law. Son of God, like citizen, is indeed an imperial title, a title that would rival and potentially challenge the emperor. However, with a focus on the audience, this exalted status of Jesus in Hebrew may also, importantly, be employed to encourage the audience to persevere their sufferings and their hardship, just as Jesus had done, in order to receive their future exaltation. The author's use of kinship establishes the authority of Jesus and redefines the audience as a people that is God's own people, and this is an example of ethnic reasoning. As a result, God's people are specifically an ethnic people. The author of Hebrews seeks to persuade his audience about this particular kind of Jewishness. He clearly makes a claim to the Abrahamic lineage, and even contends that it is in the sharing of flesh and blood that they are related to Jesus. As children of Abraham and fellow heirs of his promise, alongside Jacob and Isaac, the audience is constructed as Jewish. Similarly, Jesus is clearly depicted as Jewish in this text. The author declares, "For it is evidence that our Lord was descended from Judah." And in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests, Hebrews 7:14. Even as the audience is to understand itself to be Jewish, the author at times constructs their identity over and against a particular understanding of Jewish identity. You see, there are various ways of what it means to be Jewish. The competing understandings of covenant and ritual practices are part of an internal Jewish identity debate. Moreover, this identity can not only be redefined or clarify a group's identity among themselves. This identity that the author is proposing must also be useful, or more importantly, recognizable in its imperial landscape. The identity of the audience is reliant on previous understandings of Jewishness in order to establish a different one, a new one. Hebrews employs the language and motifs of marginalization to organize the audience theologically and geographically. In doing so, it creates a new Jewish identity. This identity depends on other aspects of Jewish identity for its formation. The dependency and the acceptance of the Levitical traditions demonstrate that this identity is legitimized by those traditions. Much like the new Negro identity of the early 20th century, this Jewish identity is constructed over and against its previous identity. It is also similarly inflected by religious and cultural practices. While this accounts for the ethnic constructions, there is also a geographical or spatial situating of this audience in this text. So let us go outside the camp. The author of Hebrews situates the audience not only in a particular lineage, but also in a particular place, by first comparing them to their ancestors in the wilderness, and then by exhorting them to move outside the camp. Hebrews 3:17 queries, was it not those who sinned whose bodies fell in the wilderness? In the precarious location of the wilderness or the desert, these fallen bodies are in fact dead bodies. These bodies are the ancestors who were rebellious and disobedient. They did not enter into the promise of God's rest. That is, they did not persevere in the faith. The ancestors not only provided examples of what not to do, right, being disobedient and rebellious, but they also exemplified an identity the audience was to embrace. In Hebrews 6:11 and 12, there is an explicit call for this assembly of persecuted believers to imitate their ancestors in the faith. They are told to be outsiders, aliens. The author writes, and we want each of you to show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of the hope at the very end, so that you may not become sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promise. See, the believers were to understand the model of the past, yet modify it appropriately for their current situation. The authors continue in describing the ancestors. All died without receiving the promises, but from a distance saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth, making it clear that they were searching for a country or a homeland. If they were remembering that country from which they came out, they would have had the opportunity to return, but they designed a better country, that is a heavenly one. The ancestors are described as embracing alterity. And this is significant because the author has called for the audience to imitate these ancestors. Their ancestors in Jesus provide examples of an identity of an outsider as they wander purposefully towards an unshakable city made by God. The motif of outsider identity reaches its climax in the text with this double articulation found in Hebrews 13:12 through 14. Therefore, Jesus also suffered outside the city gate in order to sanctify the people by his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp and bear the abuse he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. The writer reminds us that the bodies of the animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside of the camp. Therefore, Jesus suffered outside the city gate. The audience is exalted to go outside the camp. Jesus transgressed boundaries. He moved from heaven to earth and then back to heaven in this text. And he moved from inside to outside of the camp. Therefore, the call to go spatially out orients the community to move in solidarity with Jesus and beckons them to the margins of society. The call to go outside the camp repositions them spatially, even if only rhetorically so. It is in this space that their new identity can be renegotiated. Outside of the camp is only a valuable position if being inside the camp had some meaning for this audience. Right? Religions situate bodies, and the author of Hebrews wants to place their bodies out of place in this imperial context. But the autonomy of the Hebrews audience should not be denied. It is possible that some in that audience did not see themselves as aliens or strangers in their context. Identifying as an outsider and moving to or living on the margins is a precarious position. It is a position that the audience very well could have rejected, like some of the Southern blacks who chose to stay in the South. It is important to acknowledge that in this context of suffering, however, if survival is directly correlated to one's ability to embrace hope, then identifying as a stranger or a foreigner is not a confession of inferiority. Quite the contrary. It is an acknowledgement of a promising future, one that is radically different from their current condition. But let's be clear. Marginality has material implications. Outside of the camp is filled with anxiety of the uncertainty of provision, a lack of protection, and at the same time, it has hope, one that could propel a people forward. A spiritual or figurative reading of this text can minimize the danger of embracing liminality. This exhortation is more than an allusion to death and suffering. It represents the danger of the margins, a place where death and suffering are very real. The author of Hebrews proposes that the perfected Christ, who suffered outside of the camp, will perfect the suffering of this audience. In this text, suffering is seen as an embodied experience. Hebrews represents suffering in a necessary way to reach perfection. The writer describes the ill-fated faithful ones as they were tortured to death, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sown in two, by murder of the sword, they died. That's Hebrews 11:35-37. So in Hebrews, bodies are abused, confined, and even dismembered. These suffering bodies of the ancestors also wandered about. They went about in sheep and goatskin, being in need, being oppressed, being mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. Yet all of these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive the promise, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. It is clear why these suffering ancestors would have sought rest. However, this rest eludes them. Even when they are commended for their faith, they must wait. If the audience is constructed as continuing an Exodus journey, then we are witnessing similar hardship. Like their ancestors, they must wait. They must endure their suffering. In Hebrews, suffering bodies then become a site where identity can be negotiated. Thomas Tweed reminds us that bodies construct religious identity. He writes, religion begins and ends with bodies. Birth bodies and dead bodies, polluted bodies and purified bodies, enslaved bodies and freed bodies, bodies that are tattooed, pierced, flagelated, drugged, masked, and painted, kin bodies and strangers' bodies, possessed bodies and empty bodies. And as humans cross the ultimate horizon of human existence, however that horizon is imagined, bodies that are transformed and transported. These bodies not only dwell in particular spaces, but they also cross boundaries. Tweed further explicates that bodies situate individuals in national space by affirming or rejecting a homeland. As such, bodies are not solely about individual identity, they also signify collective identity. In this homily, the body signifies suffering and alienation. Placing bodies outside the camp imbues them with meaning. Outside, the bodies can be purified and made perfect. It is there that they can wait for entry into the new city, prepared for them by God. And Jesus' body provides the ultimate example. The body of Christ, as a signifier of embodied suffering, challenges reading Hebrews Christology as singularly high. While many scholars assert Hebrews Christology as high, reading the book of Hebrews through the lens of the Negro reminds us that it at the same time is low. It is in this lowliness that Christ and the audience's elevation becomes possible. Christ's body lingers over this text, suffering, sacrifice, and exalted. And now we will go to the city that is to come. The new heavenly kingdom is the future home. It is the better country. Sarah Ahmed aptly describes this concept of home. She writes that home is somewhere. It is indeed elsewhere. It is also where the subject is going. Home becomes the impossibility and the necessity of the subject's future. One never gets there, but one is always getting there, rather than the past that binds the subject to any given place. The restless, wandering saints exemplify this in the text. The audience, too, is then encouraged to look to the future, to the city that is built by God. Hebrews states, "But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to angels in festal gathering. This city is the inheritance of the audience." The author makes clear, therefore, since you are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us give thanks by which we offer God an acceptable worship with reverence and awe. However, the city is an ambivalent figure in the biblical text, similar to the way the city is depicted in the north during the migration, figured as both a land of promise and a place of one's possible moral and physical demise. By continually pointing to the future, the goal or the ideal is a utopic configuring of a system that enables a different kind of belonging. The place the writer of Hebrews describes as a kingdom that cannot be shaken is populated with angels, the assembly of the firstborn, that is Jesus, and the spirits of the righteous. This heavenly kingdom seems to be stratified, as Jesus' blood is expressly better than Abel's. Jesus was made a little bit lower than the angels and is now exalted and the firstborn distinguished from the others, begging the question, who comes first? Who will be last? How does the relocated heavenly city differ from all other earthly cities? Who will belong? Who are the outsiders? In conclusion, diasporic identity is inherently other. Never at home, but always connected to it. The identities of strangers and exiles and foreigners should be read responsibly. To the extent that marginality is a choice, Christians continue to employ this motif of being pilgrims and strangers as a way of making meaning. Hebrews creates what I refer to as an identity formerly known as Jewish, not only because I'm a fan of Prince, right? You remember when he was the artist formerly known as Prince, when his name became a symbol, right? Calling him that meant that we were always still referring to him as Prince, in the same way that the new Negro and the old Negro are related. And this Jewish identity that is being created is always related to the previous Jewish identity. The book of Hebrews will come, in the book of Hebrews, the identity that will come to be known as Christian was previously a Jewish identity. And in this text, in particular, it depends very much on the constellation of ideas that create that Jewishness, temple and sacrifice and other Levitical practices, and form Jewish identity by making ancestral claims about kinship, and yet ultimately encouraging the audience to imitate the ancestors by embracing an identity of alterity. Inextricably linked to these identities is hope. Hope for a better future, hope for a place of belonging, but they are always ever attended by danger. This is the reality of marginal identities in an imperial context. The ancestral past and the hopeful future are held in tension with the suffering that the community is currently experiencing. Although living outside the camp can be filled with danger and shame, Hebrews also introduces a new possibility of challenging such an existence. The margins can be transformed from a site of reproach and shame into a site of creativity and change. Imagining a future that is different from one's current suffering enables a community to remain hopeful. It is possible, but that this hope creates a space for community, both then and there, and here and now. Like the writer of Hebrews, the architect and developers of the new Negro trope were also looking for a better country. In our contemporary context, when I hear phrases like, "this is not who we are as Americans," or "we could be better than this as Americans," I am reminded that we too should be looking for a better country. How one understands their place in the world affects not only how we live, but also the ways in which we can envision community, justice, and peace. Simply put, place matters. In order to realize such a vision, we must then ask ourselves, where do I stand? What am I willing to go? How can I create a better country? Thank you so much for your time and attention. So does anyone have any questions?
We're a small group, so I think we can have a discussion or questions.
Yeah, I have a question for you. Is there any indication that the proponents of the Negro were inspired by the vision of Hebrews? They built their movement?
It is not. In my book, I actually look at sermons and letters that were written during that time period. And so we see a lot of themes of the Exodus narrative, but very little Hebrews.
I just have a comment. I really appreciated the tension between the ancestral past with the hopeful future, especially in marginal spaces, because even in today's time, which I think that your talk is relevant even for contemporary times, right? To live in the marginal spaces where there is violence, where there is the negotiation of space, how does one maintain hope, right? And so it made me think about Hebrews 11, and I was intrigued that Hebrews 11 starts with faith, right? But then, like in verse 37, it started talking about all this violence and how it's kind of like a hope deferred, right? They didn't realize it during their lifetime. So then, that's where the tension is. How do we maintain this hope, even whether for the new Negro or these new types of new Jewish identity in Hebrews in the midst of all of the imperial context? That tension is alive.
It is, and it is maintained throughout the entire book. Part of the beauty of Hebrews is that no one can get there until we all get there, right? And so this continual idea of suffering, right, that kind of transcends the text in our contemporary moment. Is this notion that we can be hopeful because you're waiting for me and I'm waiting for the people behind me, and that is when we all can get the Lord this rest, right? That at least that's my reading of Hebrews, is that all of these ancestors suffering, knowing, right, knowing they
quite get there, right? But they can. They will get there. But we all get there. And so I think that is where the hope lies, is that when we all get there, right, we'll be in this heavenly place, however we envision that utopia city.
Dr. Smith just said what I wanted to say. I couldn't have said, I mean, no, I couldn't have expressed it so eloquently because I'm here as you're reading to us and discussing with us. That's where we are. So have we actually grown or we're stagnant? We're still in the same place? We're constantly, is this perpetual that we're continuously trying to get to that heavenly city, but what's stopping us? In my mind, I'm going, we're still in the same place, but we're supposed to have progressed, and I don't see the progression because it's a reoccurrence of the same things, just under a different mask. Would you express it?
Yeah, when I was doing some research for the book of Hebrews, I came across a quote by Judith Butler, who is really a gender theorist, right? But she wrote, for marginalized people, hope is as crucial as bread. And that just stuck with me in kind of reading this text. There's a lot of blood. It is the bloodiest text. I think Matthew is next to it, but it mentions blood a lot. And so it kind of echoes the violence that we saw in the past and that we continue to kind of see today. But hope then becomes essential, right? It's so easy to give up, right, when you see this kind of suffering. But in the text of Hebrews, I think the author is saying we have to persevere in faith, right? That therein implies hope is in the actual going through the suffering.
As I'm listening to your lecture, and it was wonderful, thank you. It took me to, I believe it was a book that Dr. Smith had a sign at one point, Stoning the Roman trial.
Oh, yes.
And so as I think about that, and looking at the Great Migration and the separatism, if you will, with the elite in the north, and then the southern folks, so to speak. And I'm wondering if there was some type of privilege status in regards to those who were in the north who made it, and those who were coming up from the south who were trying to make it, that it became somewhat of a crab in the barrel, so to speak. And that, yes, you have traveled this way, yes, I'm going to introduce you to some things, maybe not all, but if I give you all, then what's going to be left for me? And so in terms of looking at that, I never equated it in terms of looking at it from a biblical perspective, because that's something being reared in the South until I came to Harvard Seminary. You did not question the Bible. It was basically literal. So to look at it from this perspective causes a change in thinking in regards to where do I stand, where am I willing to go, and how can I create a better country? Where I stand may not be the same place where my family and friends stand. And where am I willing to go? Am I willing to make a sacrifice for the betterment of others, but they might not understand? And how can I create a better country, which then means that if I took a stand, that I might stand alone? And so looking at all of that, it causes you to think in terms of, is it really worth it? Or is it safer to be complacent? But when there's something within you, for me, you have to ask those questions, because if you were given the opportunity to advance, then I think there's a scripture that too much is given, much is required. And so, looking at all of that, I guess everything that I'm trying to say is, when did the shift occur for you in regards to coming to this place, in terms of looking at the scripture in such a profound?
Yeah, I'd actually thought about starting this lecture similar to how I start my book, and that is that all reading is contextual, right? And so I'll begin with my own context as a Black woman in America, right? It's the way I honestly approach the text. I'm also a Black woman who's a Southerner who migrated to New York, albeit 20 years ago, right? But certainly always been fascinated by the Great Migration, and felt like akin to it in my own life in many ways. And so to research it was very easy for me, in that regard, because I felt that it was a lot of myself in that struggle to be the person who is in the Lord, and that new identity that is created when you're here, but always bringing a piece of the South with you, because someone says eventually, where are you from? And I'm like, what did I say? And how did I say it, right? And they know it's my accent. And so what that opened up for me was that there was always this negotiation within Black American identity of should I stay or should I go? And I'm not judging the choices. I mean, there's a huge debate, right? There are ministers in the South who are saying you're going to go and you're going to ride the train straight to hell. I mean, there are hundreds of sermons that I came across that were saying, there's a stop in New York, there's a stop in New Jersey, and all of these stops are stops to basically deeper levels of hell, because they wanted people to stay in the South. And so there were many reasons for people to both stay and to go. But both of those create Black American identity, right? It's not an either or proposition. So when I'm reading the biblical text and I see this kind of similar negotiation of identity, I say, why do we assume that the audience did what the writers said? The audience might have said, you can go outside the camp, but I'm going to stay right here because I'm comfortable here. And I still believe Jesus right here, right? There's no need for me to join you there. It's dangerous over there. And I don't believe that I should go over there. And both of those are equally valuable positions. I just think we don't ever elevate the voice of the audience enough to kind of hear the possibility of that type. And that's what the Negro really did for me. It opened up the possibility of hearing the audience in a different way in this text.
And I'm still hearing, when did we get there? We won't get there until we all get there, because as we're discussing, echoing in my mind, I can hear part of that speech that Reverend King had. How long? Not long. So that gives you the hope. You're going, well, I'm still trying, but not long. There's always in the back of your mind, it's not long, but not long has gone through generations after generations after generations. But it's a very important, relevant that we keep hope alive. Jesse Jackson's but it is. And I'm sitting here going like, I don't know, recently I went online to one of the few courses at DTS. And it was Hebrew. So when I saw this, I'm like, oh, I have to go. And I just really started getting into the lessons. I'm still at chapter 7. So some of this, oh yeah, this is great. But you saw you draw me to the edge of my seat here. And I'm going like, oh, but I still have that win. It just seems like weird. I don't feel stuck. I don't feel like we've been stuck, but I just don't feel like we've gotten there yet, And then I can say, well, we won't get there until we all get there. So that's going to be in that mind.
And I'm never going to forget that line, but it also occurs to me, we shouldn't get there until we all get there. So that's kind of what I take from that.
Very inspirational. And you being here lecturing to all of us is open. So it's pretty good. I've been studying the other side of the diaspora because I've been tracing from a biblical perspective, but also my own ancestry to go back. So it was great to, when I read the post that you were focusing on the Negro aspect of it, inspired me to come. So I can put the entire piece together, the entire picture.
Oh, yes, in this time period, I kind of just, there's so much to say about what was going on here in the United States. And one of the, I had the picture of Marcus Garvey, right, with UNIA, because he proposed that we go back to Africa and create our own nation. Right? And you see all these people, he had hundreds of thousands of followers in the UNIA before the government kind of took it down. But this idea, right, that we go and create our own nation, yet another voice, yet another very different voice for the new Negro. And they were using the new Negro as part of their motto. But, you know, up and mighty race. And so there was this time, during this time period, there was a lot of talk of also going back to Africa. So it wasn't just simply moving to the north and to the west, it was really reclaiming a home. So homeland from which we came.
And the interesting thing is, what would they take back to Africa that they've then picked up already in their pure context?
Let me ask you a question. I realize it may be sort of random, but so I guess I got touching different themes. So in terms of returning to Africa, was there ever any reference to the return of Jews from the Babylonian exile in any of the sermons that you could look at? I know it's kind of a shot in the dark question. I was just curious whether that thing kind of theme would ever have emerged. Sorry, putting you on the spot here.
No, it's fine. There were, I looked at the sermons and letters, and I recall the lyrics. It was a song by the rivers of Babylon, where they remembered Zion, but I just can't remember if it was a sermon or a letter. It was most likely a sermon, but I don't know that they were specifically referring to the exiles in return.
Right.
But it was, I mean, again, the Exodus motifs, even kind of the devotions in the newspaper at the time, it was called a Great Exodus by those who were actually leaving. So those motifs are found throughout most of the sermons. There is a sermon that was in the title that had exile. I just don't think it was referencing that Babylonian exile.
Sorry, I realize I guess it'd be a better manner to ask you a question about your actual topic rather than.
No. I was recently looking back at, this is a little separate, I think, from the talk that I look at it and I look at sermons and so yeah.
Just I wanted to, you mentioned you did a lot of primary research with the sermons at the time.
Yes.
I was very curious as to what major themes I noticed.
Yes, there was a lot of trains. There are a lot of sermons about trains. It was during this time period that sermons started to be recorded. And so a lot of sermons that were being recorded by kind of southern ministers would get to the north and vice versa. So the train became a very popular theme in sermons. There's also the theme, so that was one about movement. There was also a lot of suffering in the sermons, so there was a lot of this kind of hope for a better future. It was a beautiful sermon, and I'm not going to remember the minister's name. I want to think it was Cassidy, but he does this transfigured or transformed moments, and he talks about all these moments of transfiguration or transformation in the Bible, which creates this hopeful transfiguration of hope for the people who are suffering. So it's a southern minister who is trying to kind of preach hope to people who are losing relatives to the north and people who are staying and still suffering in the south. But it's this idea that you too can be transformed, and it doesn't have to be a mountaintop experience. It can be kind of in the valley that we're living in. So a lot of those themes that I kind of mentioned here are from those sermons.
I was just thinking as you were talking about tracing roots and so forth, and what came to my memory, my distant cousin is James Farmer, who started CORE, and the civil rights. And I remember first meeting him at a family reunion. And what was interesting was that when you stated some folks stayed in the South, my great aunt stayed in the South, who was a school teacher. And she felt that it was important for me to go to this family reunion. And she said, well, do you know who that gentleman is? I said, no, I don't. She said, well, he's James Farmer. And I said, okay, I don't know who he is. And then she educated me on exactly who he was. But what was interesting is that other family members knew of him, socialized with him, but didn't think that it was important enough to share the information with other members in the family because he was considered as being part of the elite, separatism for those who was in the South. So again, I go back to looking at where do I stand because I question where do I have this extra energy from in regards to wanting to take a stand and to be an advocate in some respects. I think if I traced it even more so, I would get the sense that it probably started with him, who then, because of my great aunt, stayed in the South to continue to be a school teacher and to continue to help those in the South, who then passed it on to me in terms of saying you need to make certain you get an education and you need to make sure that you pass whatever you learn on to other family members, albeit if they accept it or not, or to pass it on to someone who has a little listening ear. So I guess I'm just digesting all this information. And hopefully you have some books in the back.
I have a couple somewhere. But the idea that the Negro is an elite identity is interesting. I think it's interesting in many regards, or an identity that was created by the elite, I think is what I may have said. To the extent that all of our identities in many regards are created by the elite in society. People on the margins of everything we say about identity formation, right? So to be an elite and marginalized group is also to be marginalized, right? And so I don't think it was an idea that it wasn't, the economy wasn't really north and south when it came to elite. It was more so ideas of what it meant to be full citizen. So the elite, like Du Bois, like your aunt, thought it was education, like that was the key. And early on, it was like Booker T. Washington said, no, you just got to work, right? Work the land is yours. And if you work the land, then we can create businesses, and then the businesses will be for us. And that is how we have enfranchisement, is to show that we can build all of this. And those things happen, right? We had Oklahoma, Black Wall Street existed, right? Those things happened at the same time that Du Bois and that group were pursuing more formal kinds of education. So again, I don't think it's a either or proposition. I think it's more healthy for us to think both and those are both valuable and important ways of thinking about our identity as a people. Many of us are raised that education is the way out. It is the way that we get to whatever this end may be. Right? And education is a way, but it's not the only way. So there are those who can work in other ways, as we've seen in the past, that give us a way out.
This was great.
Can you put people so live?
Yes.
you. I really enjoyed